The G20 foreign ministers will be meeting in New Delhi today. The meet comes against the backdrop of Russia's war in Ukraine and spiraling U.S. China tensions. New Delhi, which has assumed the G20 presidency for this year, hopes that issues like climate change and third world debt are not overlooked. For more on this, we're now being joined by William Courtney, who is an international affairs expert and a senior fellow at RAND Global think tank. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. William.
Sure.
Now, the G20 foreign ministers meet will be taking place in New Delhi today. In your viewpoint, do you think that the escalating wrangling between the West and Russia over the Ukraine crisis will continue in the upcoming G20 foreign ministers meet?
Yes, as it did in the recent G20 finance ministers meeting, the issue of the war in Ukraine is likely to come up. It could come up in the context of a joint statement. For example, G20 finance ministers did not reach a joint statement, so India, as chair, issued a statement, and that statement said most countries, strongly condemn the war in Ukraine. But in this case, the foreign ministers have more direct responsibility for dealing with the war than finance ministers, so I would expect there would be sharp differences of view.
And do you think that India will be able to steer the focus of the G20 meet to other issues like climate change and debt of developing nations?
Yes, G20 meetings always cover a range of issues, and those are appropriate for a G20 context that includes so many countries. But the war in Ukraine, at least for the West, but also really globally, is quite a crucial issue. So many people are dying, and this is a case of unprovoked aggression on a scale larger than we've seen in Europe since World War II. So it is natural that the war should get a lot of attention.
Right, like you mentioned that there will be a lot of issues that will be discussed at the G20 foreign ministers meet, which will take place today. But I want to point out a fact that the G20 was formed 20 years ago to tackle economic crisis. But there are various other issues that are being discussed. So in your viewpoint, do you think that the forum is getting politicized with issues like the Ukraine war being discussed?
Well, also the G7, which was created several decades ago, was also created for economic reasons, but the press of international events caused it also to deal with foreign policy issues, political issues. And the same is true for G20. So G20 ought to make progress on economic issues, but it's important, given the humanitarian catastrophe that's taking place now in Ukraine and the threat that Russia poses to all of Europe, it's important for the G20 to take a stand.
Do you think that there will be any kind of consensus that the G20 foreign ministers will be able to reach today?
I would hope there would be some consensus. So certainly, for example, as India has backed the idea of sovereignty, respect for sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity, I would hope there would be a consensus there, but the Russians may object since they're violating the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. Also, on the issue of using nuclear weapons, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping at the Samarkand last fall both cautioned or warned President Putin not to use nuclear weapons. Before that, Putin had made several nuclear threats. After that, he calmed down in some of his nuclear rhetoric. I would hope that India and all the G20 could take a strong position that nuclear weapons should not be used in the war.
Right, absolutely. And how do you assess India's position in the Ukraine-Russia conflict? India has maintained a neutral stance so far. Do you think that India's position has evolved over time?
It has maintained a neutral stance. I think it was very helpful for Prime Minister Modi to give the caution about not using nuclear war. Also, the support for sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity of states is important. And then also, a third issue would be to condemn any targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. This has been a big concern because Russia has been launching a lot of missile and drone attacks against civilian targets in Ukraine.
Right now, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will also be attending the summit. He will be rather reaching New Delhi today. And Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is already in New Delhi. Do you expect any forward movement between the two foreign ministers in tackling the Ukraine-Russia conflict?
There are no signs thus far that Russia wants to negotiate a removal of its troops. And the West is adamant, as is Ukraine, that Russia's troops have to leave Ukraine. There's not going to be a peace deal which leaves Russian troops in Ukraine anytime soon or ever. So if Russia is willing to change its mind and talk about withdrawal, then perhaps progress is possible, but there's no sign of that.
Right now, talking about what happened last year during the G20 meet. Last July, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov walked out of the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting in Bali as the West denounced Russian invasion in Ukraine. Do you think that this time in New Delhi, tempers would come down?
I don't know what Lavrov will do, but I do not expect that the other members of the G20 have changed their view about Russia's aggression.
Right, and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will also hold bilateral talks with Indian Foreign Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar. What do you think will dominate the talks?
Well, a number of things. Certainly preparation for the G20 summit would be part of it, but certainly the war in Ukraine will be important as well. And then India is also participates with the United States in other groups as well. So there are a number of interests.
Right, and with the Chinese FM also attending the summit, do you think that there will be discussions regarding China's 12-point peace plan?
I imagine there will be some discussion at the G20 summit. Now, Secretary Blinken has made clear that the most pressing issue right now involving China is that China should not send lethal arms to Russia for Russia to use in Ukraine. But with regard to the Chinese peace plan, there are several elements of that offer some possibility of progress. Certainly the condemnation of using nuclear weapons, support for sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity are two key features of the Chinese plan that hopefully G20 partners, except maybe Russia, can agree on.
Right. Before I let you go, my last question to you. Do you think that discussions towards finding a common language in forums like G20 regarding world challenges are getting more difficult?
When major security crises, wars occur, wars tend to crown out other issues. So with regard to this war, this does not mean that issues of development, climate change, debt relief are going to be abandoned. But it is normally the case that when a war is taking place, that tends to crowd out consideration of some other issues.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. William, and sharing your insights on this.
Okay, you're welcome. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.